between 1913 and 1915, industry across this country, and I say across the country, most of the industry was on this side of the Mississippi River, heavy industry was on this side of the Mississippi. But during that 2-year period, industry experienced a 400 to 1,200% turnover rate in 2 years. That meant that every time they got somebody in and got them halfway trained, they'd pack up and move. So a branch of the commercial club in Chicago, the same group that did the Burnham plan for Chicago, the plan of Chicago, a group called the Municipal Museum Association of Chicago, which Howard Shaw was a member of, put together a survey of industry workers across the country to find out why they were so transient, and the reason was quite simple: a lack of quality housing. You have to remember that that particular time in industry in this country, we didn't have a great housing stock. We didn't have great cities that addressed the housing needs. People weren't building their own homes. They would move in, come to the country, find a job, and then try to find a place to live. So they were living in tenements, which would be maybe a 300-square-foot room with a kitchen and a bathroom at the end of the hall, and you slept in the same room with your children, and you ate in the same room you slept in, and there was no entertainment center. There were no televisions, and chances are you didn't even have a radio at that particular point in time. So as they defined the problems with housing, they also defined the solutions, and Howard Shaw was the architect of that plan. They realized that they needed 4, 5, 6, and 7-room homes. They realized that they needed what we take for granted today as modern conveniences back then. You needed central heat. You needed good light and ventilation. The houses were to be quality built materials. These are not frame houses. They're solid masonry houses. And if the gentleman on the porch would pick up that big cement block behind him, the red terracotta block, and put it right there on the porch, that's what Marktown homes are made out of. It's a fireproof masonry material. They wanted kitchen separate from everything else. They wanted a dining room that was separate in most cases, living room, separate sleeping accommodations for the children and the adults, and of course, that one thing that Pullman didn't have, full bathrooms. Pullman homes had water closets, they had a sink, and a commode. The bathing facilities were in the basement for the plant. Marktown came with bathtubs. Guaranteed, all of them came with bathtubs. The party wall between the two sides of the house is a solid masonry. They're all cast concrete basements. The way they built the neighborhood was they drained the lake first, and then they excavated down to the basement grade. They poured the footers, they put in the concrete molds with 2x12s and 2x10s. They poured the concrete foundations with steam-generated concrete mixers. They stripped off the forms and they used them for the floor joists. They built up the entire masonry houses, roofed it and put in the windows, and then the next year they came back and finished the houses with respect to the interior. All of the houses had solid maple floors. Howard Shaw was a premier architect in Chicago from 1893 till his death in 1926. We talk about his work, and you've probably seen his work and don't realize it's him. Across from Water Tower Place in Chicago's Fourth Presbyterian Church, he did the interior of the church, the garden, the fountain, and the manse. Wow. On the south end of Michigan Avenue, Second Presbyterian Church, down by McCormick Place in R. Donnelly, was by Howard Shaw after it burned. His family lived on the south side at the time on Calumet Avenue, and after the church had a fire, he helped rebuild it and redesign it and make all the stained glass windows in it. But that was one of his works with Mr. Barton, the famous Chicago muralist. University of Chicago, he did Christ Disciples Church, the Quadrangle Club, two of the Quadrangle Clubs, and about 40 estate homes at the university, Lake Forest Market Square, and about 40 estate homes up there. He has work from Florida to Toronto and from New York City to California. This is the only worker community he did. Out of the original 200 homes, all 200 were still standing. I personally worked on the design of the street 18 years ago. It was all done with federal funds. Even our sidewalks are 7-inch structurals. This was one of the few communities in North America at that time in 1917 that separated the sanitary sewers from the storm sewers. We've always had a separate system. 1917. So any questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
What's okay, health issues? Has anyone living here, I know, being in an industrial area, you been pretty healthy, or
Yes,
you
we
lived here a long
do not
time?
have a cancer cluster in this neighborhood.
Okay, really?
I will tell you that when I grew up, I thought I grew up in a Dr. Seuss book. Because when it snowed in the winter, we had pink snow. It was all serious. It was all the iron oxides from the unscrubbed open hearts.
Anymore is it like that?
No, because they closed all the open hearts. He's going to the wrong house.
Oh.
You want to tell the gentleman on the front porch that the other end that's open? The other end is open.
And then what is like property tax like around here?
Property taxes are probably the cheapest for a couple of reasons, but if it's owner-occupied and you have a homestead exemption, they're about $200 a year. If not, they're about $600 a year.
I kind of
Property tax.
I hire it done. I won't go up there.
No, but there's like
There's party wall agreements that require that both sides be done. It's simultaneous. And those you can get a neighbor to go along with that. Sir?
You mentioned a lake that had been here and drained.
Berry Lake, and it went from right at the tip of Lake Michigan south to Columbus Drive, in New Addition and clear over to Indianapolis Boulevard, and it was used through the 1800s for ice harvest in the winter for the Chicago meat market.
What was its name again?
Berry Lake.
Berry Lake.
It's on our webpage in one of our newsletters, probably January of this year. We did a 2 or 4 page spread on the history of Berry Lake.
Okay.
Matter of fact, the tank farm right on the corner there that you can see part of the tank from, that's called the Berry Lake Tank Farm. They drained the lake originally for Standard Oil when they were building Standard Oil. They finished draining the lake when the canal went through, and when they built the first tank farm over there, they actually had to row out to look at the manual gauges in a boat because there was still water around it. So, but it was the Berry Lake Tank Farm.
How much do these houses cost to work?
They weren't. They were sold after World War II. In 1938, Ford Motor Company was sued, and it wound up in federal courts. Had it been filed during World War II, it would have been considered un-American. The decision was finally handed down in 1942 during the war. It was a decision against Ford Motor Company because they had a charter for the manufacturing of automobiles, and Henry Ford had turned it into a conglomerate. If he needed tires, he bought the tire company. If the tire company needed rubber, he bought the rubber plantation. If he needed lumber for the wooden frame cars, he bought the forest, the sawmill, and the railroad to deliver to the factory. So he had to dissolve all of that. At the same time he dissolved that, or they sold off all of that, was in the middle of World War II, and the company here sold the property to a land company and wouldn't permit it to be resold to individuals until the servicemen returned from the war. Now, out of a 200-home community, we had over 160 young men and women in World War II. I believe 7 of them died. And in 48, they finally went public, and they sold for $5,000 to $10,000 then.
What company owns the houses?
It started with Mark Manufacturing in 1913, who opened Mark Manufacturing here. Clayton Mark was an industrialist that designed and patented what's called CBW, continuous butt weld pipe. And before he did that, all of the water pipe in America was cast iron, which meant you couldn't get high pressure on it because there was no way to switch them together. He was being held hostage by the Eastern Steel Companies. We say that, but it was Ohio and Pennsylvania. And he wanted his own steel company here. There were 70 or 80 steel mills in Chicago at that time, but they were all mini mills, and they all worked for specific companies. There were 2 different companies that worked strictly for International Harvesters in Chicago, and they made steel strictly for them. So his only way out was to come up with his own steel company.